Carney declared that Canada would accelerate its strategic pivot toward China through new agricultural agreements that could sideline U.S. buyers from Canada's grain market for years to come. How did matters reach this point? What impact will this have on American consumers already struggling with rising food prices? And why are supply chain experts warning that this could become the most severe disruption to the North American food system in modern times? What is unfolding reveals three major failures that are quietly reshaping global agriculture. According to recently confirmed information, including assessments from strategic research institutes and trade policy analysts, the Trump administration approached Canada through informal channels, seeking exemptions or reductions in agricultural tariffs that are paralyzing cross-border food flows. The numbers underscore the severity of the situation. Tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act are hitting Canadian agricultural products at rates ranging from 25 to 35%. This effectively erects massive barriers against $18 to $22 billion worth of annual trade. Canadian wheat, on which the U.S. market relies to produce staples such as bread and pasta, is being directly affected. In the most recent crop year, Canada exported approximately 57.4 million tons of grain, with the United States long serving as a primary destination for wheat, canola, and other agricultural products. That landscape, however, has now shifted dramatically. During an official visit to Beijing, Prime Minister Carney stood alongside President Xi Jinping to announce a comprehensive bilateral agricultural trade framework. Under the agreement, China agreed to cut tariffs on Canadian canola from 85% to 15%. At the same time, the previous 100% tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobster, crab, and peas were removed entirely. In return, Canada expanded market access for Chinese electric vehicles and committed to a significant increase in agricultural exports to the Chinese market. These moves demonstrate that Ottawa is actively redirecting agricultural trade flows at a time when tensions with Washington show no sign of easing, a shift that could carry long-term consequences for the entire regional food system. And from there, events drift even further from the normal trajectory of Canada-US relations. Prime Minister Mark Carney stated bluntly in public that China is now more predictable than the United States. For many Canadians, that remark would have triggered an immediate jolt, given that the memory of arbitrary detentions lasting more than 1,000 days still carries enormous emotional weight. When a Canadian Prime Minister is compelled to draw such a comparison, it is not merely a provocative headline grabber. It is a signal that Ottawa is reassessing risk through a new lens, not based on labels such as democratic or authoritarian, but on the stability of the rules of the game and the predictability of trade behavior. The real-world consequences are already becoming visible. The experience of Jennifer Patterson, a third-generation wheat farmer in North Dakota, offers a telling example. Her operation has purchased Canadian wheat for processing and export for 4 decades. Since the tariffs took effect, she says her input costs have risen by roughly 30%, forcing her to pivot to alternative suppliers in Australia and Argentina at higher prices, immediately eroding her margins. The most painful part, she explains, is not just the financial hit. It is the sense of watching decades of cross-border cooperation unravel, while Washington behaves as though supply chains can simply be reassembled in a matter of weeks. To understand why this is so dangerous, one must look at the depth of integration in North American agriculture. The United States, Canada, and Mexico have spent nearly 3 decades building a tightly interwoven agricultural trading system, from NAFTA to USMCA. Canada produces at scale. The US operates highly optimized milling, blending, processing, and re-export networks, and Mexico plays a crucial role in consumption and food supply chains. Large volumes of Canadian wheat, especially spring wheat, have long crossed the border on what is effectively a pre-programmed rhythm into US storage facilities, mills, and contracts. Those assets were designed around the specific quality characteristics, reliability, and delivery schedules of Canadian supply. Put plainly, this is not something you replace at the push of a button. What makes the situation worse is that President Donald Trump's tariff policy does not merely create higher costs, it creates legal fog. When the White House invokes emergency-style justifications to impose tariffs, only for federal courts to strike down parts of them while appeals remain pending, businesses are left unable to plan. They do not know whether tariffs will remain in place, increase, or be lifted altogether. In agricultural trade, that kind of uncertainty is toxic. Why? because agriculture operates on seasonal cycles, long-term contracts, and fixed shipping schedules. A mill cannot sign raw material contracts without knowing what post-tariff prices will look like. Logistics firms cannot lock in vessel schedules if cross-border costs could change with a single court ruling. International buyers cannot commit to purchasing US-made flour or pasta if America's upstream inputs risk disruption at any moment. As a result, instead of waiting for Washington to stabilize, market participants do what markets always do in the face of political risk. They leave in search of certainty elsewhere. That is the crux of the structural rupture you are building toward in this piece. Tariffs do not merely push prices higher. They fracture confidence in the continuity of the system itself. And once supply chains have redirected toward Australia, Argentina, or new contractual corridors with Asia, even the sudden disappearance of tariffs offers no guarantee they will revert to their previous paths. In the world of agricultural trade, the most expensive cost is not an extra few days of shipping. It is the risk of staking an entire growing season on a partner whose rules can change overnight with a political statement or a new round of litigation. If one wishes, the next section can be written in the same distinctly Canadian voice, addressing 1. What the 3 catastrophic failures actually are, 2. The internal tug-of-war between U.S. farmers' interests and President Donald Trump's broader strategy, and 3. Why Ottawa views the conclusion of long-term contracts with China as a way to lock in protection against risk emanating from Washington, even at significant domestic political cost. In this environment, almost no one is willing to make long-term investment decisions. And viewed through the lens of history, the picture is unsettlingly familiar. Decades ago, U.S. grain embargoes against the Soviet Union inflicted severe damage on American farmers, not because the Soviet Union lacked food, but because it quickly secured alternative suppliers. Once those markets shifted, it took years for U.S. agriculture to claw its way back, and some trade relationships were never restored at all. What is unfolding today bears the hallmarks of that same historical pattern, with one crucial difference. This time, it is the United States itself erecting barriers against its closest partners. Those partners, rather than waiting passively, are actively pivoting toward China. In this new landscape, China is emerging as a central buyer of Canadian agricultural products. Trade data makes this trend unmistakably clear. Over the past 5 years, China has become Canada's largest wheat import market, accounting for roughly 10% of total Canadian wheat exports. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney's new strategy, Ottawa aims to double exports to markets outside the United States, from approximately $125 billion to $250 billion. Agricultural exports to China alone, currently valued at around $32 billion per year, already represent nearly 1/4 of that target. Carney has been candid about his calculus. The objective is to reduce dependence on an increasingly unpredictable U.S. market by securing long-term agreements with China and other Asian customers. To grasp the real significance of this strategy, consider a simple, everyday analogy. Imagine you have been a loyal customer of the same bakery for 30 years, buying bread there because of consistent quality and a long-standing relationship. Then one day, you begin demanding deep price cuts, threatening to walk away unless the baker accepts impossible terms, and even publicly suggesting that perhaps you do not really need their bread anymore. Eventually, the baker finds a new customer, one willing to pay more and sign a long-term contract. When that happens, the old relationship is not merely strained, it is effectively over. When you finally realize that you still need that loaf of bread and decide to return, what do you find? The baker has long since moved on. That, in miniature, is what is happening in agricultural markets today. And to understand why the consequences are so severe, one must confront how supply chains actually function. North America's grain supply chains are not simple roads, but dense interlocking networks involving cross-border transportation, storage systems, rail infrastructure, port capacity, and processing facilities. Canadian wheat frequently passes through U.S. ports for export to global markets. American grain, in turn, is blended with Canadian wheat varieties to meet precise requirements for quality, protein content, and consistency demanded by different customers around the world. When tariffs of 25% to 35% are imposed on this system, the entire machine grinds to a halt almost immediately. Shipping routes that once operated smoothly become risky and unpredictable. Rail operators such as Canadian National Railway, which had reported record-high grain volumes in the most recent harvest, are now facing profound uncertainty over future contracts. Ports in Seattle, Portland, and other hubs across the Pacific Northwest, long heavily dependent on grain flows from Canada, are already registering a marked decline in throughput. Deeper within the supply chain, grain elevators are beginning to operate with excess capacity. Mills and food processing plants are running below optimal levels. No segment is insulated from the disruption. Every link is affected, from transporters and storage operators to final stage manufacturers. This carries troubling implications for American consumers. According to data from the United States Department of Agriculture, wheat prices have risen by roughly 12% since the tariffs were imposed. Food producers have not absorbed these increases. Instead, they have passed the costs directly on to buyers. The average U.S. household spends around $8,000 per year on food. As grain prices climb, the knock-on effects are immediate. Higher prices for bread, pasta, breakfast cereals, baked goods, and hundreds of other essential items. And that is only the short-term impact. More concerning are the long-term consequences, as supply chains that took decades to build risk being dismantled in ways that are extremely difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. Canadian farmers are now planning their planting decisions around a very practical question: who will be buying their crops in the coming years? If Chinese firms offer attractive prices coupled with long-term contracts, while the U.S. market remains overshadowed by volatile and unpredictable tariffs, where will production naturally be directed? The answer is increasingly clear. Once those trade relationships are formalized, once Chinese food processors begin to rely on stable Canadian supply, and once logistics networks are reconfigured around Pacific ports, reversing those flows becomes far more difficult. Experts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies warn that the upcoming USMCA review will be a pivotal moment. Canada's dairy supply management system, agricultural rules of origin, and the broader architecture of North American food security are all facing the risk of serious fracture. Prime Minister Mark Carney has made it clear that the old relationship model with the United States, one built on ever deeper integration, has reached its endpoint. He enters negotiations from a fundamentally different position. Diversification away from the U.S. market is no longer a bargaining threat, but an active policy direction already underway. So who bears the immediate cost when North America's agricultural supply chains are disrupted? The ripple effects are spreading simultaneously across multiple groups. First and foremost are American workers and households, who are feeling the pressure almost at once. Food inflation, which had previously shown signs of easing, is now accelerating again. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that prices for grain-based products rose by approximately 12% in just the initial weeks after the tariffs took effect. For a family of four, that increase translates into nearly $960 in additional annual food costs, assuming prices do not continue to climb. But the impact does not stop with end consumers. American farmers who have long relied on Canadian supply are now caught in a tightening bind. Wheat growers in Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota have traditionally blended domestic varieties with Canadian wheat to meet export standards for quality and consistency. With that linkage disrupted, they are now forced either to source more expensive alternatives or to accept lower prices for their crops because they no longer meet the specifications demanded by international markets. Small businesses across the agricultural supply chain are facing existential risks. A telling example is Heartland Mills, a family-owned grain processor in Kansas, which has used Canadian spring wheat for blending and export for 3 generations. The owner, who requested anonymity out of concern about regulatory retaliation, told industry publications that tariffs have driven input costs up by nearly 28%. The company cannot pass the full increase on to customers without losing contracts to foreign competitors. That leaves 2 equally bleak options: absorb sustained losses that threaten the firm's survival, or shut down operations altogether, laying off 140 workers in a rural town with virtually no alternative employment opportunities. Cross-border agricultural transport companies are also absorbing a severe shock, with shipment volumes down 40 to 60%. These are not diversified conglomerates capable of offsetting losses across multiple business lines, but small, family-run firms owning only a handful of trucks, many of which have served the same routes for decades. When volumes collapse, they cannot easily pivot to other types of freight. The result is bankruptcy, and with it the permanent loss of specialized logistics capacity from the system. At a higher level, major agribusiness firms are making strategic decisions that could reshape North American agriculture for decades. Giants such as Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland, and other global grain traders are quietly adjusting procurement strategies to reduce reliance on intra-regional cross-border flows. According to analysts, they are increasing sourcing from South America, accepting higher transportation costs, because policy and regulatory stability are now viewed as more valuable than short-term savings. As these firms shift direction, investment capital for processing plants, storage facilities, and logistics infrastructure is likely to move with them. Financial markets are already reflecting this heightened uncertainty. Agricultural equipment manufacturers such as John Deere have seen their share prices come under pressure as investors begin to question future machinery demand, particularly if North American agriculture evolves toward models less dependent on cross-border supply chains. Fertilizer companies, which rely heavily on integrated distribution networks between Canada and the United States, are facing similar headwinds. Meanwhile, international partners are watching developments with a mix of concern and opportunism. The European Union, despite its own agricultural trade disputes with both the United States and Canada, is seeking to position itself as a more stable supplier to both markets. Australian wheat exporters, for their part, are actively courting U.S. buyers, emphasizing reliability and consistency in contrast to the tariff-driven volatility now defining the North American trade environment. Despite continuing to grapple with its own economic challenges, Argentina is aggressively expanding its grain production capacity with the explicit aim of capturing market share disrupted by North American supply. In the broader picture, however, the clearest strategic beneficiary is China. Through agricultural agreements with Canada, Beijing is securing outcomes it has been unable to achieve through direct confrontation with the United States. Food security, a core priority of the Chinese Communist Party, is being reinforced through long-term contracts with Canadian suppliers. Chinese negotiators are exploiting a moment when Canada urgently needs markets beyond the United States to lock in favorable terms, guaranteeing stable supply for years to come. Trade experts have therefore issued increasingly stark warnings. Dr. Maria Stefan, a specialist at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, argues that the disintegration of the North American agricultural system is a self-inflicted wound, one that could take an entire generation to repair. In her view, the United States is voluntarily surrendering a critical strategic advantage, control over the most productive and deeply integrated agricultural region in the world. The reaction from the expert community has been swift and notably alarmed. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who leads the province at the heart of Canada's agricultural economy, has described the current situation as a crisis entirely of Washington's making. He has warned that American consumers will ultimately bear the cost of reckless tariff policies through higher food prices and reduced access to staple products that have been part of their lives for generations. At the same time, agricultural economists at several major universities have begun modeling the long-term consequences. A study from the University of California, Davis, projects that if the current trade disruption persists beyond 18 months, structural changes in North American agricultural supply chains will become entrenched. Farmers typically make multi-year decisions regarding land use, equipment investment, and crop selection. Once those decisions tilt toward less integrated markets, reversing course would require substantial capital and many years of rebuilding commercial relationships. The legal fallout surrounding the USMCA further compounds uncertainty. Article 34.7 of the agreement mandates a formal review process that was originally conceived as a routine assessment of implementation. Under current conditions, however, that review is evolving into a high-risk renegotiation, with agricultural market access emerging as a central flashpoint. Canada has made its position clear. Any extension of the agreement must be accompanied by firm guarantees of market access and an end to the arbitrary imposition of tariffs. Failing that, Ottawa has stated plainly that it will opt for annual reviews, creating prolonged uncertainty that would deter investment and gradually push trade away from the North American integration model. Political reactions in Washington are sharply divided. Many Republican lawmakers representing agricultural states privately acknowledge that tariffs are inflicting direct harm on their constituents, yet few are willing to confront the Trump administration publicly. Democrats, meanwhile, are seizing the moment to argue that the president's trade policy is incoherent, unpredictable, and ultimately undermining America's own economic interests. Yet the most troubling common thread is that neither party